So can you hear me at the back? Please say if you don't, because I'm in Emerita and my voice gets weaker, I find. Anyway, I really hardly need to tell this audience how important publication is in the life of researchers. It's the sine qua non, Latin for without which not. So it's a very important phenomenon to understand and to make work in your favor. The point of my talk is to flag for your consideration what I'm characterizing as the political dimension of publishing critical qualitative health research, particularly in the health sciences field. That's where I come from. I'm using the notion of political in its sociological sense, referring to the social forces and relations of authority that are governed by the interplay of interests, ideology, social location. There are many players orbiting around the academic publication system, including authors, peer reviewers, editors, users such as other researchers, government, industry, lay and community organizations, and so on. So publication is not a unitary phenomenon. It signifies and produces very different things for the different participants. And participants all have different standpoints. Standpoint refers to the position from which one views the world, the vantage point afforded by one's social circumstance and location. So standpoints both produce and reflect particular perspectives and interests and stakes. And so standpoints and their associated actions influence the fate of researchers seeking to get their work published. So today, this is what I want to do. First, I want to identify some key players and standpoints in the field of publication and suggest how they render publication political. Second, I want to overlay this with the addition of a trio of political challenges confronting those aspiring to publish, particularly in the health field. The challenges associated with publishing research that is simultaneously critical, qualitative, and focused on the social determinants of health. Kind of triple whammy in the publication. First, there's publication from the standpoint of authors. I used to teach a course that focused on how to write qualitative theses and publication. Writing, I emphasized, is quintessentially political. Writing positions the author, it creates the subject, it locates the story, it strategically deploys evidence, creates the value and grab of the message, and distinguishes the voice of the author from other voices in the text, and so on. I also taught about writing a qualitative research for readers who are not qualitative researchers, and how to strategically frame findings for different and sometimes unreceptive stakeholders without dumbing down or compromising methodology. So for authors then, writing for publication is a political exercise as much as it is a scientific one. Then there's publication from the standpoint of peer reviewers for journals. Here, the place and engagement with publication is different than for the author. The role of the peer reviewer is more accountable to the interests of the field of qualitative research as a whole, a field that has a stake in legitimizing qualitative research and gaining entry into the health research literature, but also a stake in keeping out poor quality papers that give qualitative research a bad name. Reviewers have to decide between simply recommending rejection, let's say, of inadequate papers, and devoting scarce time and energy to the much more difficult alternative, offering a thoughtful critique that might give authors a chance to improve and to resubmit. I recently struggled with a review of a paper for a journal called Trials, which is a journal of clinical and community interventions. And some big name researchers had submitted a paper on the value of qualitative evaluation in this field. The paper had problems, but I really wanted to see qualitative research put forward in this context. And I thought it could be fixed. So I recommended a revise and resubmit. The others, of course, well, not of course, the others rejected it. So I was overruled. But I'm using that as an example of how, my desire to kind of get qualitative research positioned in the field affects the way I read and receive submissions as a reviewer. Sometimes, too, manuscripts create a conflict of interest for the reviewer, where the findings can contradict or scoop the reviewer's own research. Reviewers are, after all, chosen because they're working in the same area. So in other words, there's a lot at play besides the inherent quality of a manuscript. Peer review has its political dimensions too. Rupaleem will be saying a bit more about this, I'm sure. So then we have editors. As gatekeepers to the publishing castle, journal editors play a key role in the publication process. Here, again, gatekeeping activity involves more than straightforward scholarly adjudication. A critical task is deciding who to select as peer reviewers, the selection of which largely determines the fate of the paper. But what's involved in that decision? Do you seek a content expert or a methods expert? How good or promising does a paper have to be to avoid wasting the precious time and goodwill of reviewers who do reviews on a voluntary basis, jamming it into already crowded schedules? Who is in your circle of contacts as a editor? How does the list of possible reviewers and the classification of their skills get generated, and by whom do those lists get generated? There are lots of other kinds of editor decisions that influence publication decisions, like reconciling science with economics in the competitive publishing marketplace. Yes, that impact factor stuff. And Eric is going to tell you more about some of it. My point here is that the editor's desk is a site of political and administrative endeavor that profoundly affects the trajectory and the fate of manuscripts. The publication record is at the heart of academic promotion and is highly political in the sense that I'm using the term. Numbers of publications sometimes matter more than the quality and content. Sometimes there are conflicting meanings and valuations that are attached to things like solo versus team authorships, theoretical versus empirical research, or the disciplinary parentage of the journal, with social science journals being typically either unknown or undervalued in the health field. So here too, the political dimension of publication comes into view. Publication takes place in a wider marketplace of knowledge, consisting of those who fund the research and use the research. Users include organizational administrators, policymakers, community activists, and the academy itself. And their interests and stakes both affect and are affected by publication issues. Published research is an important vehicle and signifiers of legitimacy and power, and the politics of evidence is everywhere in play. The core point I'm trying to make here is that there are multiple players and standpoints in the political arena, in the publication arena, which makes publication way more complex than the skeletal, scholarly idea that if you do good science and communicate it well, that you'll get published. Publication is where the intrinsic quality of research and active writing encounters the extrinsic context and political process. But these observations are of research publishing in general. For critical qualitative health researchers, another layer of political considerations must be layered on. There are two elements of special consequence to the publishing of critical qualitative health research. First, First, it draws heavily on the social sciences in a field in which the dominant scientific worldview is biomedical, and where social science is unknown or conceived in its pop varieties, and are correspondingly undervalued and accorded lower scientific status, as Albert and others have documented. Because of its social science orientation, critical qualitative health research occupies a marginalized position and has limited scientific capital, which translates directly into its potential to get published. A second element affecting the publication of critical qualitative health research is its embeddedness in applied professional and administrative concerns, where there are pressures for content and outcomes to be politically accountable. Moreover, health research is an exercise in high stakes and high emotion. The subject matter is life and death, and governments have a huge financial and political stake in research and the demonstration of effectiveness and efficiency. High status researchers and topics are involved, and big industry and big philanthropy make additional particular kinds of demands on research and its publication. Consider the presence of critical qualitative research in a research world in which the quantitative randomized controlled trial is the superior form of knowledge production. Here, with qualitative, the absence of numeric results, a very different research process, questioning of basic assumptions, a consideration of power, social science conceptualizations of data, potentially inconvenient findings, and the audacity to move beyond the conceded territorial confines of documenting patient experience, which is where qualitative tends to get bundled. Yikes! It's not an easy sell in the health science publication marketplace. So, in summary, I've tried to draw attention to some of the political aspects of publishing critical qualitative health research by identifying the multiple stakes and standpoints of the different players in the publication arena. I also noted an additional layer of political consideration confronting those who are practicing critical qualitative research in the health field in particular. However, it's one thing to be alerted to the politics of publishing, but quite another to know how to respond as a qualitative health researcher. How can you figure out the particular political ecology of the publishing context you're in? Is it possible to be politically strategic in publishing without selling your soul to the devil, compromising your core research principles and practices? What are the future prospects for publishing research that is at once qualitative, informed by social science theory, and critical? In other words, research that is clearly transgressive in its publishing media. The recent British Medical Journal decision that Paula referred to is obviously not an auspicious omen for the future, and Eric is going to pick up on that. So I hope to hear from, well, we hope, I'm sure, to hear from all of you about these kinds of matters, so I urge you to think about some of the things I've been saying when we hear from the next two, who are, I think, going to be talking more about their more personal, concrete encounters with publication.
Joan's comments, because you raised so many great questions, and I'm thinking especially about the ecology of publishing. And I think they're dynamic. So when this proposal for a panel came forward, I was scratching my head and thinking, okay, what does this look like in different social workspaces? I'm not, I'm going to stand up. I'm an active, kinesthetic. I don't publish a lot in health myself. I do a lot of work in migration and violence against women, which can be seen as a health phenomenon, but often intertwined with other forms of social injustice. So I talked with, so I'm going to be presenting, there we go. I don't know my frame of mind when I wrote this title, but I'm going to be presenting more informally conversations I've had with different colleagues who do publish in health and social work, from my own work on the editorial board of Affiliate. It's a feminist-oriented social work journal. Next week, I'm going to be one of those co-editors. So I guess I'll be responsible for the ecology of the journal, and we're trying to be really transparent about it. So I'll save some remarks about my experience there. And then just as someone trying to publish in various journals. My work's very interdisciplinary. So often I'm working in policy arenas, as well as public health, public affairs, and social work. So mixed reviews are microaggressions. Anyone publishing 3,000 words articles? Raise your hand if your work fits. There's like 5 people. Does it fit? You know, this is hard, but this is the structural reality. So I started, you can't read this cartoon, goes far away, so I'll read it. I was just trying to be playful. This was on a blog that was something about anxiety in publishing in academia. That was the title of the blog. And on the left it says, I can't believe it. Fang Publishing rejected my horror book. The friend says, sorry to hear that, Mimi. Did they use a form letter? In the middle it says, yes, but the editor also wrote something extra on the letter. The friend says, don't let this discourage you. In fact, count it as a good sign that the editor took the time to personalize it. And over here it says, dear author, it says, for submitting your travesty to Fang Publishing. Unfortunately, it does not meet our needs at this time or any other time. Sincerely, the editor's PS, have you considered sheep farming? Okay. So anyone received a rejection letter recently and felt like you were being told you probably don't belong in this world as an academic? So this is like probably the mindset I was in when I came up with this title. You know, publishing has that very personal political intertwine, and I want to maybe present some analysis about what's at stake here, especially when different forms of knowledge are sequestered, are segregated, or not seen as valid. And then I'd love for dialogue to see where this affects the work that you're trying to do. So microaggressions. So I think I wrote the abstract when the Cleveland Indians, so-called Indians, were not my kind of Indian, I guess, that was inside joke. I don't usually do that joke in public. They were in the World Series, you know, and my mother is a huge baseball fan. And so we had these conversations in the family. It was a public conversation in Canada and the US. Like, can we tolerate this? Which I would say is more than a microaggression. And I have a close friend who was successful in getting her high school, she's Quinault from the Pacific Northwest, to change, she and other youth, to change their mascot, which was something like this, a misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, to something a little bit more politically tolerable. But this is still an ongoing issue. We also think of microaggressions when in our everyday contact with people. This happens to me at least once a week. Where are you really from? You know, I think of it as sincere and also part of the kind of white settlerism that we're in and who really belongs here, who looks like they're American. You will never be a real woman. This also intersects across multiple forms of oppression. Right now on Toronto's campus, University of Toronto, we're embroiled in this controversy around pronouns and people declaring that they shouldn't have to use the pronoun that other people want to be used for them. So this is a huge ongoing issue. We also have the political context of Trump. This is an image because a Hamilton judge featured the hat that said, "Make America Great Again" in his court the day after Trump won the US election. So these types of representations, we can call it white nationalism or maybe other things, are happening in Ontario. And then racial carding, which maybe is on that spectrum of micro to macro forms of violence. So what does this have to do with publishing? You know, does this even make sense? So I look up some definitions. I teach about microaggression here in social work. And the psychiatrist Chester Pierce, who's an African-American psychiatrist and educator from Harvard, in the 70s theorized these microaggressions, specifically in terms of racial, interactions on a daily basis. Su, also a psychologist, brought this forward and defines it as brief, commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, the political ecology piece, whether intentional or not, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, and religious slights, and insults to the target person or group. So a lot of the theory around microaggression is focused on social identity groups, but also processes. We see this in terms of, like I said, the police, but also mascots. Again, how does this play out in research? So Su came up with a taxonomy, which I find very helpful. We have the more, what he calls micro-assaults. These are the more overt forms of racism or sexism, homophobia, how these things intertwined. They're blatant expressions of bias or bigotry. We have what they refer to as micro-insults. These might be communications that convey rudeness, insensitivity, demean a person's subjectivity, identity, usually carrying a hidden message. Like, where are you really from? Carrying a hidden message. You must not really be from here. The people from here look a different way than what you look like. I need you to account for your otherness. That's what I hear when people say that. Microinvalidation. So this is often considered unintentional communications or environmental cues that exclude, negate, or nullify. Here they're referring to psychological thoughts and feelings, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of epistemologies, forms of knowledges, ways of knowing, since we're thinking about research, and how these often negate the reality of many groups. So an intersectionality frame, for me, is very useful when thinking about microaggressions in scholarship. I think about Kimberly Crenshaw's work as a Black feminist scholar who came up with this term, although a lot of Black feminist thought had been thinking about intersections for pretty much 100 years, in thinking in the US context in particular, Black women having these multiple forms of oppression in their lives, especially those from enslaved or formerly enslaved populations. She actually has a recent TED Talk I highly recommend, came out in October, which she talks about where those ideas came from, but she starts off her lecture asking the crowd to stand up. And she reads out, I'm going to give it away, but it'll still be a good TED Talk. She reads out 4 or 5 names, and she asks people to sit down if they don't recognize the name. So she reads out the 4 or 5 names, about half the people sit down. Then she reads out another 4 or 5 names, and then everyone sits down except for maybe 2 or 3. And in the first group, they were all people who had been killed by the police and were Black men. And about half the room was standing up. The second group were also people who had been killed by police, but they were all Black women. And it was very profound to have this kind of shared realization of the invisibility of forms of violence, particularly because, at least in the United States, I think in Canada too, there's a lot of public outcry against violence against women, and a lot of public outcry against police violence against Black people. And yet this particular crowd, probably well-informed, middle-class people, didn't know anything about the Black women who had been murdered. So I think there's a lot at stake when we see these forms of negation of lived realities. So when we think about intersectionality, what is the point at which multiple different areas of potential discrimination come together to overlap and also coexist, reify forms of exclusion? And in the context of research, to ask ourselves, what are the different levels of discrimination that folks engaging in qualitative research methods, taking on different types of social theory, specifically in the health sciences, but also social work that is critiquing the status quo? What are the multiple forms of discrimination we may face? I have a list here that I've found related to my work, thinking about subjectivity of myself. And not many people know Assamese people who do research in social work, so what ways in which the knowledges I draw from, are they even considered relevant in the academic space? Institutional resources, so at U of T, that is not our problem, but certainly when I've worked at more regional universities, just getting the access to resources to be able to do research, even if your proposal is flawless, is much harder if your institution is not seen as credible or hasn't produced a lot of research. The epistemological position of the author, whether you're taking on critical feminist, decolonizing, intersectional lenses, this may make it harder for reviewers who don't understand where you're coming from to evaluate your work. And then the subjectivities of those involved in research. In Affiliate, we published an article last year where a scholar had looked at social work journals over a 10-year period, I think like 2008 to 2000. I'm not quite sure the 10-year period now that I'm thinking, but she was looking at who's writing about women, especially women of color, in social work journals. In most of the key journals, I think she looked at 20, less than 10% of the articles were specifically about women of color. Even though we know, in terms of multiple disadvantage, they have the most forms of inequality. I mean, we know that from other forms of data. And then when they were talking about women and women of color, even fewer. So the two journals that we're publishing were Affiliate and Health and Social Work. So I'm thinking about how can you have a good impact factor if you're publishing in an area where no one else is publishing in? So these are some of the politics that affect the world that I'm working in. So micro-insults, micro-invalidations. I thought I'd look back at some of the papers I had submitted for review and show you some comments. So this is not ethical in terms of, so I'm not going to tell you what the journal is or anything. I'm not under an ethics protocol. So this is more as a point of discussion. These are things people wrote back to me. I still got the papers published. That's good. So they weren't total gatekeepers. In this one, it says, present a discussion. This is the comment from the reviewer. Of common themes across the data. How often did the responses appear? Anybody have that happen to you? Frequency, right? Frequency assumed to be a form of credibility, of significance. Another journal said, this journal doesn't allow the use of the term significant in cases other than statistical significance. So I changed this word to prominent. Let me know if that works for you. Okay, I'm not allowed to use the word, like they've taken over entire terminology. I can't say significant. It's not significant unless we use the assumptions of positivist inquiry. This one says about generalizability, and because of time, I'm going to jump forward. This is my favorite. The word oppressive is often inflammatory. Why not wait to introduce it after you build your argument? I fear you'll turn away potential readers. So I don't know about you, but often what I have when I'm in a relationship with reviewers, whether I'm getting rejected or mixed reviews or accepted, is this feeling that what I'm saying is not real, especially because I'm focusing on different forms of oppression. And I think in this sentence, I literally said oppressive structures, but it was too inflammatory. So when I looked at social work, when I talked with my peers in social work, some of the things they told me when they're publishing in health journals, a little bit better than what the British Journal of Medicine is doing, is they do see an epistemic bias. They're required to talk about positivist criteria to show the value of their work. The structural constraints are real. I usually publish in journals that allow me up to 15,000 words. But I only get credit for one. Now, whereas those of my colleagues who published in 3,000 to 5,000 still get credit for one. So, I'm still doing more work. But it's a lot more space to show your data, to show your methodology, theorize the social arena. There's also segregation going on. So journals that only will publish hard data, like British Journal of Medicine, and then you have journals that maybe are more issue-specific, nursing and social work also as more open to publishing qualitative. What does that mean when we're creating these maybe epistemic spaces of critical thought, but are also usually low impact factor journals? Maybe they're seen as less consequential to the political economy of academia. There are exceptions, plus one, I was told, is publishing a lot of qualitative research. Another friend of mine in genetics said there's a genetic journal that's publishing a lot. I'm out of time. I'll stop there. There are two developments that I wanted to share. One is the Journal of the Society for Social Work Research recently issued new guidelines for people reporting qualitative data. It's fascinating. This article is not yet in print. I got an in-press copy. But they show their process. And I have, for example, here, the second bullet. They're going to delete the reference to data analysis software. It was recommended to them that coding software does little more than retrieve data. Emphasizing the use of software might give a false legitimacy to the analysis. So they're changing their guidelines. I think that's promising. And then in affiliate, what we've done is in the reviewer selection process, we have a consulting editor team. We always have every article reviewed by someone who has been an established feminist scholar. It's been hard to figure out how to do that. So people who want to be a consulting editor have to apply. So we put a lot of burden on those folks, but then we feel more sure that they have the epistemological resources to evaluate feminist scholarship. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion later. Thanks.
Great. So thank you. I'm happy to be here too. Oh, this is bad because I have these glasses. I need to see this, but I can't see anything. I'm happy to be here to participate in this discussion, and I'm going to be speaking primarily. Really? Okay. Is that better? That's like shouting. Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to be speaking primarily in my capacity as the senior editor at the Canadian Journal of Public Health, responsible for the review of qualitative manuscripts. And I'm going to focus my remarks on a number of the changes that we've introduced to the review of those manuscripts over the past couple of years, and some of the issues that arise as a consequence of those changes. And I'm doing that because I think that they are important intervention into the conditions of publishing qualitative health research in Canada. And I want you to know about them. I have a very strategic interest being here, which is to get the word out about what we're doing. And I would like you to understand what we're doing. I'd like you to share that with your colleagues. And I would like you to consider the CJPH as a potential venue for your work if you are in fact doing critical, theoretically informed qualitative research that addresses issues of public health relevance. So I want to begin though with a few remarks about context. Oh, that's pretty small. Oh well, sorry about that. Anyway, so I think there are, Joan has spoken to a number of aspects of context which create for those of us who do research in universities a kind of threatened environment for the viability, the long-term viability of critical qualitative research on public health issues. And I want to bring some of those to mind before I speak more specifically about the things we're doing at CJPH. And I think we're all quite familiar with the consequences of the proliferation of the evidence-based paradigm and particular interpretations of its hierarchy of knowledge, which confer marginal status on qualitative inquiry. And certainly traces of that form of reason were apparent in the BMJ response to the Twitter phenomenon that arose after the McGill Qualitative Health Research Group published a segment of the Alex Clark's rejection letter. And in the editorial response to the letter of protest that Tricia Greenhow led, the editors warned their decision by stating that qualitative studies are usually exploratory by their very nature and do not provide generalizable answers. So we can see sort of the lineaments of the evidence-based reasoning in how they frame their justification for their decisions. But in the original letter, rejection letter, the part that was shared publicly, they relied principally on the logic of the research market, which I think Joan has spoken about in her remarks. And in their view, which I think was effectively challenged by Greenhow and her colleagues, qualitative research is a sales risk. Right? It is not as wide, in their words, it is not as widely accessed, downloaded, or cited as other research. So here we have an expression of commodification and competition in academic research that folks like Michael Billig in his book, Learn to Write Badly, How to Succeed in the Social Sciences, has really written about quite eloquently. And what he writes about is changes in our work, and in particular the emergence of a mass publication market in academic research, which is itself a feature of the growing commercialization of the academy, increasingly marked by, we all feel this, right? Audit culture, competition, endless promotion of oneself and one's work. If I read another Facebook tweet post about my research accomplishment, I'm going to throw up. Even though I feel compelled to do the same thing myself. Right? It's like insane, right? The relentless pressures to publish continuously and voluminously, and an ever-growing specialization of our research endeavors. And in his view, what's really interesting about his book is how he describes how those changing relations of knowledge seep into writing, into academic writing, resulting in what he describes as poor quality, hastily written work that positions the scholar as academic retailer or advertiser. And so I have to say that, I've been in the position, I've been on the board at CJPH for many years, but in my role as senior editor only for a year. And one of the most prominent features of that experience seems to be encountering work that is very hastily written. I imagine the person who's writing the article desperately trying to finish this thing off to get onto the next piece of the machine production that they're attending to. So papers that are really not carefully written, papers that they sort of suggest a work practice in which the person has forgotten to say something interesting, important. I'm serious. I don't want to sound hypercritical, but it's as though what you see is these relations of work, and you don't see an attempt to engage thoughtfully and to ensure that you say something important and analytically meaningful. And so as we all know, our academic work is being increasingly routinized, standardized, and subject to managerial forms of assessment and accountability, just like any other form of professional work in our historical present. The problem I think that this poses for qualitative research is that qualitative research is a craft knowledge. That takes time, effort, and that requires a particular kind of care, not only in its design and execution, but in its writing particularly. And so my goal, one of my goals at CJPH is to try to resist the pressures that Billig has written about and to try to create a space for work that does other than the kind of machine production that he problematizes. So, what are we doing at CJPH? Well, we're trying to intervene, yeah. Oh, that's the wrong way. Okay, so some of you will be familiar with the paper that Joan and I published a number of years ago. And this was our attempt, I think, to intervene in the discussions that were occurring at the time about how to assess qualitative health research. And we described those established modes of evaluation within the health sciences as derivative of modes of critical appraisal that were established in clinical epidemiology, and they were being transferred to the assessment of health research. And we emphasized that the approaches that resulted were excessively procedural in their focus, highly standardized. They equated quality with the proper execution of research technique, and were unable to address the non-formulaic nature of qualitative inquiry. And they relied very heavily on the checklist as a textual form for constraining and channeling the kind of critical imagination of reviewers. And we proposed an alternative which we named substantive judgment. And substantive judgment, as we imagined it, directs attention to the analytic and argumentative character of research and of writing, and is concerned with method not as a standard procedure, compliance with which is the focus of the reviewer's sort of approach to thinking about the manuscript, but instead trying to encourage a concern with method as it relates to and as a resource for understanding the research topic and the findings being written about. And so one of the things that we've really been doing at CJPH is trying to instrumentalize this approach to review, try to create an actual system for reviewing manuscripts that moves in the direction of more substantive judgment, given a prior history of the checklists that were the case at CJPH, as is the case with many other health sciences type journals that accept qualitative research. So what has this involved? And I want to just describe this a little bit for you. I would emphasize that this has been a collective endeavor involving a group of associate editors, including Brenda Bagan, Mary Ellen McDonald, Melanie Rock, Barbara Gibson, Joan, myself, and most recently Nathalie Beausoleil. One of the first things we've done is to establish new guidelines for reviewers, a new set of questions that reviewers are required to address, and build a cadre of reviewers who can approach the assessment of qualitative research in the manner in which we would like to see. So here I've just reproduced for you the explicit instructions that reviewers receive when they are going to review for a qualitative article in the journal. And I've highlighted in yellow the ways in which we are trying to ensure that they do not fall into a kind of procedural assessment by, for example, emphasizing that, checklist tools don't work. There's no, one answer. There's no right way of doing research. Don't impose a template, etc., etc. So this is something that the reviewer reads, hopefully, before they do the actual assessment. And then the review itself is structured in terms of a series of questions that are designed to prohibit a review that is organized as compliance with, the checklist items, right? So, I don't know, did they do member checking? Yes, that's good. Like, maybe not, right? Did they? I don't know. I can't even remember what they are. That's been a while. Did they? Is it generalizable? Yes. No. Like, maybe that's not so relevant, right? So we're trying to ensure that that type of judgment and way of thinking doesn't creep into people's assessment by framing questions that can't be answered as in yes and no ways. What we're doing here is organizing our request of the reviewer in ways that demand a form of narrative assessment and engagement that expresses the reviewer's particular relationship to the text and that emphasizes matters of argument and substance rather than procedure construed or considered as a technique. And so each question there also has with it in the review form these explanations of what we're asking for. And I just reproduced at the bottom the one for how effectively has the paper study been designed and conducted, where we tell the reviewer we want you to tell us about how well the author's description of the design may work to permit the reader to understand where the findings are coming from, that kind of thing, rather than did they do it the right way kind of thing. And then the final thing that we've done is really spent a lot of time building up a cadre of reviewers who understand critical qualitative research and who can evaluate it successfully. So what has been the result? Overall, I'm quite confident that we have been receiving really quite excellent reviews. It's been great to see. But some problems have arisen. One of the problems is that the standards are now higher, so it's more difficult to get published in the journal, I think. And it's also the case that improvements in the review process won't necessarily generate improvements in the quality of research that we're publishing if we don't get better articles at the submission stage. We still attract a lot of the sort of health sciencey type approaches to qualitative research. And we haven't yet had a lot of success, or not enough success in my view, attracting work that has the kind of character that we associate with critical theoretically informed research. And there are many reasons for that, which I will pass over right now. And so what we're trying to do is target that whole problem by making as an objective over the next couple of years attracting higher quality manuscripts at the submission stage. And there are a few things that we're trying to do to make that happen. The first is to really create a reputation for CJBH as an important and desirable place to publish critical, theoretically informed qualitative research on public health issues. I would like to make it clear to the research community that we are committed to publishing this type of work, and that if you do this kind of work, that you have confidence that it will be treated seriously and fairly. If you know of opportunities to reach out to those potential scholars who are doing this kind of work, let me know. Either I or one of our associate editors would be, I think, very happy to share with them the kind of approach that we're trying to take to publishing qualitative research. And I would like to instill in our research community a sense of that it's important and is a privilege and a responsibility to actually contribute to the national journal that is the collective voice of public health research in this country. We've created a space for qualitative research to participate in that conversation, and I really would like people to recognize that and to take up that invitation. A few other things just really quickly, because I'm going to be going to our board meeting today, and I want to pitch some of this. So if I get some feedback on these things, that's very helpful for me. It strengthens my position. We will be approaching, I think, specific individuals to submit reviews or submit articles. I am going to make a best pitch that I can to increase the word count to 5,000. It's currently around 3,500. I stretch it to 4, and that's just the article. That doesn't include references or anything else or your abstract. So it's really getting there. We're moving in the right direction. And we will consider a potential special section of the journal, likely for if it's successful, at the end of the next year, which will include a key article announcing the new direction and some key exemplary articles that we will publish alongside. So, thank you very much.